Hello, folks. I wanted to add a little bit of detail to what we had talked about in our last plate tectonics lecture and just highlight a couple of key details and key misconceptions that I want to clarify. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about plate tectonics on Earth. I'm going to mention that lithospheric plates, we might also say tectonic plates, they refer to the same thing. This just highlights that it is the lithosphere that makes up the plate, so that's the crust in the very upper part of the mantle, and that each plate on Earth, each tectonic plate or lithospheric plate, can have both types of crust on it simultaneously. So a plate often will have both continental and oceanic crust on it. I want to highlight why there are 7 subtypes of boundaries. We talked about each of those 7 subtypes before, but I'm going to talk about a little bit why there are 7 and not 6 or 9 or what have you. And then I'm going to mention some important plate tectonic boundaries today that you really should know either as examples or because they have an effect on life in the US. Since this is a US-based course, it's often prudent to talk about those plate tectonic boundaries that affect us more than others. First, I would like to highlight that lithospheric plates often have both types of crust on them. That is, many plates have both continental and oceanic crusts on the same lithospheric plate, on the same tectonic plate. For example, if we're going to look over here at the North American plate that we are on, we can see clearly that there's a lot of continental crust on that because we have a big continent there. Also, we've got a lot of ocean on the right-hand side. And if we were to go over and look at the bathymetry map, right, the map that shows us what the depth is, we'll see out here that there's a lot of deep ocean that makes up this part of the crust. This is going to be oceanic crust. And so we have both continental and oceanic crust as part of the same North American plate. I'd also like to highlight that all oceans are not necessarily over oceanic crust. So the very shallowest parts of the oceans, those continental shelves right offshore in many places, are actually over continental crust. So on this map, we can see them, they're the light blue bits right here. Those are the shallow seas here. And we can see them off the eastern coast of the US and part of the western coast of Florida there and the Gulf Coast, right? Those places, you go there and it's the ocean, but it's maybe only a couple 100 meters deep instead of several kilometers deep like we have over oceanic crust. So all of this part here in the light blue, that's actually continental crust underlying shallow ocean. Just wanted to highlight that there's a little bit more complexity there than just saying like a continental plate and an oceanic plate. That's not the case, right? We had talked about these 7 subtypes of plate tectonic boundaries, where we had 3 main types, the convergent, divergent, and transform, and then we broke those down. And there were 3 types of convergent plate boundaries, 2 types of divergent, and 2 types of transform boundaries. If you look at this, you notice that all types have a continental and an oceanic, right? So divergent have a continental and an oceanic type, transform have a continental and oceanic type. Convergent has one that's 2 continents colliding and 2 oceans colliding, but it also has this 3rd type where a continental margin or the continental crust can collide with some oceanic crust at this type of plate tectonic boundary. So why is that special for convergent boundaries? Think of it another way. Why don't we have any continental oceanic divergent boundaries? So you can see one that I've drawn over here. Hypothetically, why don't we have a boundary like this, where the plates are moving apart this way, and one tectonic plate has continental crust and the other one has oceanic crust, and that boundary is right in between them? Well, it turns out if we had some boundary like this, we set it up hypothetically, and we started to do this divergence, it would quickly become an oceanic convergent boundary, because what matters here is really what's happening right at that boundary. So the next step after this, remember that what's contributing the new oceanic crust here is going to be mostly partial melting of the mantle down here. And so as that mantle partially melts, that melt is going to be slightly more felsic than the mantle itself, but it's still going to be basaltic in composition. And that means that it's going to be much like the oceanic crust in composition. And when that stuff comes up to the surface, as we move forward in time, it's going to make oceanic crust on both sides of the divergent boundary. And now this boundary is basically just an oceanic divergent boundary. It happens relatively quickly. So even if we had a setup like this, it would only last for a very short time. And we would very soon be able to think of it as an oceanic boundary. Similarly, the continental boundary that we're familiar with, that divergent boundary in the East African rift that's rifting apart right here. Right now it's continental because we only have a small influence from all that magma coming up. Most of the crust is still continental, but as soon as that opens up enough to start making any new oceanic crust, it's going to make it on both sides of that split. So right now, it looks something like this, right? Where this is continental, and this is continental. But very soon, as soon as that opens up enough, it's going to be oceanic. Okay, why don't we have, say, a continental oceanic transform boundary then? Can't have a divergent one. What about a transform one? Well, the San Andreas Fault is about as close as we get to that, where we have a transform boundary, that San Andreas Fault. On one side, we've got the North American plate, which in this area is all going to be continental crust. And then we have the Pacific plate, most of which is oceanic crust right on offshore of it. But there's only a couple spots where this boundary seems to match up, where it's continent on one side and ocean on the other. And it's only for a very small area. It's really unlikely for these boundaries, the continent ocean and the plate boundaries, to match up exactly. Like we saw before, any given plate can consist at least of continental and oceanic crust, and it's unlikely that the boundaries will exactly match up. So even here, which is about as close as we get, most of this length is like a continental transform. And then just offshore, like this part here, it's already more like an ocean transform. And the tiny little points at which it seems to be continental on one side and oceanic on the other are really transient. They don't exist for very long in time, and they're a very short area in space. So we don't tend to talk about them as a separate type of boundary. It doesn't really do much for us in terms of classification. So then why do we have a continental oceanic convergent boundary? Well, turns out that the process of convergence is very different from the process of divergence at divergent boundaries or processes going on at transform boundaries. It's not the case that convergent motion is just the opposite of divergent motion. Remember, they're very different. In the convergent motion, especially where we have subduction happening like we have over here, one whole lithospheric plate is subducting under another one. That's not the opposite of what's going on at divergent boundaries, where new crust is being formed on both sides. Oceanic plates can subduct under continents for a long time over a long distance. It will probably take several million years for all this oceanic crust here to subduct. And that oceanic crust is going to be oceanic crust for that whole time, and it does so along a whole big length. So it makes sense to talk about continental oceanic boundaries because we have a lot of them and they last for a long time. I'll also point out that at these convergent boundaries, they have effects over a much wider area. It's not just what's happening at the boundary that matters, but much more so than the other types, it matters and affects what's happening far inland of there. So it has much more to do with the crust far inland and less to do with the crust right at the boundary surface. So even hypothetically, if we had just a little bit of ocean crust right here, the whole boundary, this whole continental oceanic convergent boundary, is going to behave like a continental oceanic boundary and not an ocean boundary, because it's subducting under this continent that exists tens to hundreds of kilometers inland. Because the process is just like the continental ocean convergent boundary. We're not going to make a new special type where we have ocean-ocean convergent on the edge of a continent. The same sort of stuff is going on. And there are some more details there about accretionary wedges and stuff like that you talk about more in detail if you go further on in geology, but we're not going to really talk about that in here. And that's processes like this where you get, maybe you might have island arcs running into continents and sticking to them over time. So this is before and this is after down here. And that's what formed a lot of the eastern coast of the US, but we really, over hundreds of millions of years, we don't talk about that too much in here, and we're just not going to. I'd like to point out some important plate tectonic boundaries today, both on Earth and for the US. Just to highlight these one more time, a major set that you talk about is this set of boundaries here, going all the way around the Pacific, ringing those continents. And that includes these boundaries here usually. This is called the Ring of Fire. Why do you think they call it that? It's because there's a lot of geological activity, many volcanoes ringing this whole boundary. Japan, the Philippines, into Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, some on islands in the middle of the Pacific, and then along South America. And there are even some active volcanoes like Mount Rainier in Washington. I think Mount Rainier is technically dormant. I'm not sure though. But you even have some volcanoes that can affect the Northwest US. There are so many volcanoes there and there's so many earthquakes around this perimeter as well that this is really well known. And we talk about the Ring of Fire a lot. This is what we're referring to here. This ring of geologic activity around the Pacific Ocean, where you have a lot of convergent boundaries, so a lot of volcanoes and earthquakes from that. And then what's not convergent, you'll have a lot of transform boundaries along the western coast of the US, which I've zoomed in on over here on the right. And that's where the San Andreas Fault is. San Andreas Fault is here. San Andreas Fault is here. And it runs basically right through San Francisco, and it runs near Los Angeles. So it can have big effects on both of those cities. Turns out that this subduction zone here, right, that can feed the volcanoes in the Pacific Northwest is also going to have some potential effects on the Oregon and Washington coast as well. This whole region is at risk from tsunamis happening because of the potential for earthquakes offshore here. We've had huge earthquakes in the recent history of the San Andreas. In fact, it was a big earthquake in the early 1900s that destroyed about a third of San Francisco and led to us rebuilding San Francisco how we did, and led to us understanding a lot more about earthquakes and their hazards. So we'll talk more about that when we get to the earthquake specific lecture. Now, if we look at this area over here on the eastern coast of the US, we'll notice that there are no plate tectonic boundaries there right now. We're pretty tectonically inactive, quiescent on the eastern coast and the eastern edge of the US. So we don't have too many earthquakes here. What earthquakes we do have are relatively minor. And the nearest boundaries that we got are all the way down in the Caribbean. And then to the east, the mostly divergent boundary in the center of the Atlantic Ocean. And that has some effects, like sometimes we get volcanoes up in Iceland, but relatively speaking, that has little effect on us in the US. Of course, there are other boundaries that are really important in the world sense, and we just don't talk about them as much, in the US unless you get into upper level geology courses. For example, there are a lot of earthquakes that occur in Turkey and Iran. There are a lot of earthquakes that occur in Nepal and northern India and southwestern China. We just don't talk about those boundaries as much because it doesn't affect us, truth be told, at least in these intro classes. Thanks for listening to this supplement. I'll see you next time.